welcome back to the Korea Now podcast, and welcome back to a returning guest to the podcast. I've done two separate interviews with this guest before, and both got very impressive reviews from the listeners, which is always high praise indeed. The first one we did was on reconciliation and memory and war, and the second one was on the North Korean socio-political system, both of which I will link below. But there is another significant aspect of this person's work, which is China, and we're going to speak about that today. This is professor at Korea University and author of Kim Il-sung in the Khrushchev Era, Balázs Szalontai. Balázs, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Very kind of you.
Oh, it really is my pleasure. The podcasts we always do together, they start off and they get pretty good traction. And then over time, I always get all these emails coming in from listeners asking about the podcast and little details. And so for that and for listeners, I always link below my podcasts the articles that we speak about. And I will do that again for Balazs's articles today. So let's jump into China and North Korean relations. And the first part we might jump to is the Korean War and this short dossier that you wrote about the Korean War. And there's these three different timelines. The first potential reading of the Korean War and China goes something like this. One particular article that found its way to the Wilson Center, and it goes on to say that war seems inevitable and North Korea are reaching out for Chinese help potentially. Then there's a second document from the Hungarians, which seems to imply that China and North Korea had already reached an agreement on a suitable time for a second Korean War. So we're talking about second Korean Wars here. And then there's a third document and a third narrative and a third way to read this. And this is that the Chinese are pushing this and they're the prime aggressor. And you open up the issue in your article and you go into all the details. So please do that for us now and explain what the narratives are and which one perhaps is most plausible, if at all?
Oh, yeah. And this is a really complex issue because first I became aware of this problem when a Chinese scholar in 2013, Chen Xiaohe, raised this matter. And, this was a period when Chinese-North Korean relations were really very tense, very uncomfortable because of the North Korean nuclear test and other things. So it gave Chinese scholars a bit like additional motivation to tell critical things about North Korea. And so Professor Chen mentioned a Chinese document which quoted Kim Il-sung saying, that if we do a next war, then we will need China's assistance. And the implication was that North Korea wanted to start a new war. And it very much fit into the model of how situation looked like in 2013. So it very easily got accepted and believed at face value. But I happen to remember that I read something about this issue before in the Hungarian archives, which was from the more or less same period, 1965, but it approached the issue from a very different perspective. So I looked into it, and then it really looked different because the Chinese ambassador himself was talking about this matter. But instead of presenting it as something coming from the North Korean, he presented it as a sort of mutual agreement that China is ready to start a kind of continent-wide offensive in Asia to expel the Americans. That with North Korea, we had an agreement to attack the Americans in South Korea. With Indonesia, we have an agreement to attack Malaysia and so and so. So it looked very scary. And then it was also a little bit suspicious because the Chinese ambassador telling this to Soviet bloc diplomats was very, very unusual that your most important military secrets you tell to somebody whom you don't trust at all and whom you don't like at all. It was very like out of place. So then I started to feel that maybe there is something behind these words, that the words themselves don't mean exactly what they literally mean. So I looked up the Chinese document translated form, which Professor Chen quoted. And then again, it looked a bit more cautious than that Kim Il-sung was not very actively pushing for a joint invasion or something like this. He rather like raised the possibility that maybe there will be some war and then we would need the Chinese help. But he was not very like specific and pushy on that, rather different from how he was talking in 1950. So then I started to feel that maybe it's a more complex matter. And now it's still difficult, of course, to know how it started, but I put it together with what other scholars, most especially, Lawrence Luty, found about Chinese warnings sent to the United States about Vietnam, when China already expected that Americans might intervene in Vietnam with like large military force, and they wanted to deter the Americans, wanted to send a warning. So it seems to me at the moment, and I really feel this is probably the most likely explanation, then the Chinese, by telling these stories about like likelihood of a new war in Korea, they actually did not mean exactly that. Instead they wanted to send a warning to Americans that if you push too hard in Vietnam, we can retaliate elsewhere in Asia. So think twice before you do something rash. So when the Chinese started talking that way, it really made probably the North Koreans think that, okay, maybe better to know what exactly is going on. And so Kim Il-sung made some probes that what he can expect from China. And then we have one more twist of the story, that in 1965, when all this is going on, already there is a kind of improvement of relations between North Korea and the Soviet Union, something which China disapproved. So the Soviets were really very much against any sort of North Korean adventurism, any sort of attack on South Korea. So when the Soviets asked the North Koreans about this matter, they said, well, of course, we don't want to do anything like this. There's some others encourage us to attack South Korea, but of course we don't. So this created a really like very strange situation, because by that time, the North Koreans really got to the point of making some commando raids on South Korea in 1966. By that time, their relationship with China became really bad, increasingly worse and worse. And the Chinese definitely did not encourage them to do anything of that kind. But still, they pretended that they got this advice from the Chinese, and the Chinese pushed them, and they still resist. So it created a lot of confusion.
Well, I will link that article below. There's more within there and more detail, but there's so much to get to. So let's talk about China, and let's do it in some sort of chronological fashion, though it's going to jump around a bit. Let's talk about China's role in North Korea's economic transformation. And you start your article with a very interesting analogy here, which in some ways is quite appropriate. And that is, so many countries, so many developing countries have developed through export-orientated industrialization. And this is what South Korea did, of course. So you asked the question, why didn't North Korea follow the same track as South Korea. And you go on to say that in the early days, they did. They were keen to follow this strategy. So let's take us there for a moment and the early days of industrialization and North Korea's efforts to export its way to growth.
Yeah, this is something really important because to understand that how abnormal it is that such a country like North Korea cannot export anything more sophisticated than minerals and natural products and some textiles, but otherwise it really plays a very marginal role in world trade. To understand how abnormal this is and how much it affects the whole international bargaining position of the country, it's important to keep in mind that we have countries like Bangladesh or Cambodia, which started with a much more lower level of industrialization than what Korea inherited from the Japanese period and what they built up after that. But still now, if we look into the export structure of Bangladesh or Cambodia, it's like over 90% of manufactured goods. It's another kind of thing, of course, that they are not very sophisticated in manufactured products. Mostly it's textiles and clothes. But still, they became really successful exporters. And they did it under very negative conditions from the perspective of the World Bank and other institutions of this kind, because they reached it with a rather high level of corruption and a lot of other management problems. So they were really not an ideal, environment, but they still did remarkably well along this rather narrow track. But North Korea never achieved anything like this. So it's really very interesting to see why it was so. If they were interested indeed already in the mid 1950s to develop an industrial basis, to provide themselves with their own manufactured products and even to export machines to Southeast Asia and other countries, why they could never reach that? So this is something very important because in my opinion, we really need to look at this issue in a kind of balanced way because when we look into the Soviet bloc documents, of course, we get a narrative which is very critical of North Korea. And it lists very carefully a lot of problems which the North Koreans pose to anybody who wants to do trade with them. So it's very clear that they were probably the worst type of trade partner you can imagine. Very unreliable, very aggressively pushy, very unilateral. So in many ways, it's very easy to find a continuity that how they do trade now with other partners and how they did trade with the Soviet bloc for many years before. So it's very easy to say, well, they were always like this, and they were always very difficult people to deal with. This is very much true. But
So,
what we
sorry, please.
can,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, go, please.
what we can also find if we dig a bit deeper in these documents, that they also had their justified complaints, that they also felt being exploited by the Soviet bloc because the Soviet bloc pushed them to export minerals. They were not interested in a more sophisticated export composition. They said, we have a sort of supranational economic operation. We can look at each country, what is their competitive average, competitive edge. what they can provide, what others cannot. Look at North Korea. They have so many minerals, especially non-ferrous metals, copper, gold, and things like that. So this is what they should export to the others which lack them. So the North Koreans were pushed to specialize on this, and this is already a problem because it creates a very narrow like export composition. But then you have the second problem, which is worse, that the Soviet bloc had a very special price system in which manufactured products were priced abnormally high compared to world market prices, and raw materials were priced abnormally low. So the North Koreans got cheated two ways because when they export, they get a lower price, what they should and what they deserved in their opinion. And when they buy something, then they have to pay a higher price. So this was a really big problem as a starting point to sum it up, because to have export-oriented industrialization like South Korea, you need an environment which encourages you to do that. So you need some sort of technology uh, to do it, but you also need a market which is sufficiently open and encourages you to produce for export. So in the North Korean case, they were really not trying to adapt to the external markets. They rather adopted the attitude that this is what I have, you should buy it. But also, the market was not very welcoming, not very encouraging.
Let's talk about that in terms of China. So you spoke about the Soviet Union there. What were Chinese preferences for imports from North Korea, and what impact did this play? Because there's a point in here that you do this interesting analogy and comparison, and you begin to explain why it may or may not fit that North Korea fell into that tried and tested trap of resource dependency.
Yeah, unfortunately, this kind of negative experience with the Soviet bloc got repeated in the case of China, because China also needed mostly raw materials and natural products from North Korea. Because in terms of textiles and clothes, China has its own rather good capacities. What they really needed from North Korea was some good quality anthracite coal and some metals like gold or iron, and then some seafood and other kind of things. But otherwise, they felt either we can produce ourselves, or if we need something sophisticated industrial products, then we get it from the Japanese, we get it from South Korea. We don't really need North Korea for that. So it really gave a sort of reinforcement to the old pattern that if you interact with China, then China will push you on a sort of narrow track, and it's very difficult to branch out and diversify your export structure. So it does not mean that China was like absolutely unwilling to take anything more from North Korea, but it's a bit like a chicken and egg problems that unless North Korea offers something better in terms of industrial products, what they have at the present, then the Chinese will go elsewhere to get it. And unless the Chinese give them a sufficient incentive, then the North Koreans will remain in the level where they are. So this is something very curious, because the countries which did give some stimulus to North Korea in a period, 1990s especially, to develop something more sophisticated, to develop some export-oriented manufacturing, at least a little bit. These were the Japanese and the South Koreans, not the Chinese. It's very interesting that did happen in the 1990s that North Korea started to do something similar like South Korea or Taiwan or Bangladesh, that to import the raw materials, import the technology, import the investment, just do the labor work at home and then export it again. So this is what they did with clothes, which was rather simple to do. And it was the Japanese who also became the market for it, and South Korea at the second place. China was not very much providing an input in this, also not providing a market. So this is something very important implication politically, because it means that if the nuclear crisis closes the North Korean doors to Japan and South Korea and forces it to rely on China, then eventually it makes the North Korean economy more distorted, less able to open up, less able to become more diversified. So in a sense, it's a very serious implication of the sanction system, that instead of like making North Korea becoming a more sophisticated economy, which is supposedly more able to survive without nuclear extortion and more able to become like a normal member of the international community, instead, the sanctions push North Korea to become even more distorted and orienting toward China and not very much able to provide much to the world, which the world is interested to take.
Now, there's a very interesting question here about China's potential role in North Korean economic reforms. Every time you turn on the news, people are talking about the hopes for political and economic reform inside North Korea. And at different points, you put emphasis on these two elements here. That one, that for a start, China is such a attractive prospect for someone like North Korea because they don't demand political reform or economic reform before they engage. But at the same time, they did do a number of small yet important steps to encourage North Korea towards economic reform in other countries. So I might open that question up for you and explain that to us.
Please. Well, this is a kind of difficult issue because officially, the Chinese line toward North Korea and every other country, especially developing countries, is that we don't interfere with how you manage the economy. They are very proud of that. This is an official line that we are not like the Americans, we are not like the Western Europeans who interfere and say, oh, you must fix that, you must do this, you must reduce corruption, you must have more transparency, all that. The Chinese really don't try to do anything like this, at least officially. So this creates a sort of like double-edged swords, because the China position is that we don't push them to change their conduct, which means the Chinese like don't give them a reason to improve their conduct. But at the same time, of course, Chinese companies are not stupid. They also realize that this is not a welcoming environment. So it also means that the really biggest Chinese companies usually prefer not to go to North Korea. At best, the medium level companies go, whenever they could. Now, of course, with the pandemic is very different. So I am speaking in present time, but I speak about the pre-COVID period. So the medium level companies would go, but they know very well that if they get into any problem there, the Chinese state will not be able to help them out and will not really try to interfere on their behalf. So they take a big risk and sometimes they suffer the consequences because the North Korean state, the North Korean authorities and joint ventures are working in a very unpredictable way. As far as I read in the literature, like by Justin Hastings or Peter Ward and others, it works in a way that if the higher North Korean authorities suddenly start pressuring a North Korean venture uh, to cough up more money because the state needs it for purposes of its own, then of course the joint venture cannot easily produce this money so abruptly. So the way they get it is by defrauding the foreign partner. And then the foreign partner feels really being like badly treated because abruptly it's being ripped off. So they try to complain, but very little chance to get anything. So often they live in a really bad mood. And once it happens more and more, then less and less companies are willing to take the risk unless something really good terms are offered. So this creates a sort of very complicated situation that the Chinese don't interfere with North Korean practices, but they rather quietly pull back and don't give full support and really extensive investment because they understand that this is not a good place.
Uh, there's a interesting place at the end of your article here. You talk about a comparison with with Burma or Myanmar, and you speak about there are some differences here, but there's a lot of similarities in so many ways as well. You say that the Burmese were open to exports to China, mostly comprised natural resources. They ran a sizable trade deficit. And you run this comparison through, and at the end, it still looks pretty bleak in some ways. You go on to say that despite all of this assistance, there was no real change in transparency. The private sector inside Burma was still horribly repressed. Corruption never changed. So, and of course, this comes to a question of, is there any value in trying to liberalize a country from outside, or is there any hope that these things will ever happen?
Now, this is something very interesting because I wrote this article in the period, or I did the research on it in the period when Burma or Myanmar was still ruled by the old military regime. And it was a really very interesting story because the system was extremely corrupt. It's extremely badly managed. But it also can be seen now as I looked into the data, especially World Bank statistical data on governance and other things, that what could or did not stimulate export-oriented industrialization in Myanmar was very much the relationship with the world market. So in the 1990s, when the economic sanctions were not really so broad, then there were still investment coming from South Korea, for example. And then Myanmar would export textiles and other things, mostly textiles, to the Western markets, 1990s. Even though the country had an extremely bad infrastructure, extremely high level of corruption. But then, the Western powers, especially the United States, basically erect a barrier to such exports. So then the Myanmar industrial exports went down very sharply. Japan took some, but absolutely not enough to maintain the level. So then they reoriented toward China and again in terms of raw materials mostly. Now, after they normalized their relationship with the Western countries after like 2013, we see a sudden, very, very abrupt jump in the level of industrial exports. And like many, many countries suddenly discover Myanmar around 2014, 2015 as a sort of like frontier. Okay, go there, invest there. And if you look into the, say, Cambodian press, you see almost a sort of hysteria that now all these companies are going to Myanmar instead of Cambodia because the wage level in Myanmar is even lower than here. Then how we can compete with that? How we can push the wages even more lower? So it was very clear that you simply cannot fix corruption and mismanagement within 1 year so drastically. If you look into the statistical data, there is a little bit of improvement. Yes, they try to fix things under this civilian government, but it's impossible to do it within 2 years so abruptly to get such a huge surge of investment. So it was very clear that it was mostly at the external market, the availability of external credit, the openness of the external environment, which gave this incentive to do this so much high increase of exports. So from this, we can also draw the conclusion that in North Korea, the problem of corruption and mismanagement is also very serious. It's very clear. Everybody can see that. But what is the bigger problem? It's not simply that this corruption, it's more that the whole environment is so unpredictable, both in terms of nuclear crisis, but also in terms of defrauding foreign partner. So some scholars did interesting research on corruption in places like Cambodia and Bangladesh. And this is what I am also doing now in recent times. That it's one interesting conclusion what we can make that for the investor familiar with corruption, that means like a Chinese investor or Taiwanese or Hong Kong company, for which it's not an abnormal and new situation that you have a corruption level in such a country like Bangladesh. For them, if we have corruption in a kind of ordinary and regular and systematic way, it is not a big problem because it can even help us. If you regularly pay the officials, please don't disturb us. Please like do speedy work. Don't hold up don't hold up us with red tape. Do it fast. Then they are willing to pay because then it gets things done. It's like the greasing the wheels, as they say in the literature. What they really hate when the regulation can change overnight, totally unpredictably, and then they are being ripped off. Paying regularly for this kind of things, it's fine. And then if we have a kind of administration like Hun Sen in Cambodia, which is totally corrupt, of course, and very autocratic, but still smart enough to understand that milking the cow on a long term is better than killing it off, and then eating the meat and then you have nothing left. So unfortunately with North Korea, it's still not that way. That their external behavior is very unpredictable, so nobody really wants to invest in a place like this. Their internal behavior is very unpredictable, And then the foreign environment retaliates with more sanctions. So it is really like a kind of downward spiral.
I really hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, and I apologize for this interruption, but I'm just going to take this moment to remind our listeners that we've made a conscious decision here in the KareerNet podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast, and you listen regularly, and you do want it to continue, it is important that you do your best to support us at the links below, or by sharing, liking, or commenting on the podcast across social media. All your help in this regard is invaluable. And now back to the episode. Let's jump again. We're making big jumps here. I'm all consciously aware of how much detail we're leaving behind. So again, the economic article will be linked below. So let's jump to the triangular relationship between Japan, China, and South Korea, and North Korea trying to play this pivot role in the middle. So we're going to focus perhaps on the period after 2012, but we should start before that and give the historical background and the Cold War period. And there's very interesting things that you wrote in this period that struck out. Things like the North Korean leaders stared across at Japan and saw them as a very important economic power. But even then, in the early Cold War period, no longer considered them a significant military power or not a significant security risk. And people like, or countries like China were getting involved with countries like Japan in very Cold War ways, hoping that they could convince Japan to decouple themselves from recognizing Taiwan and things like this. So take us to that very interesting Cold War period and this triangular relationship.
Yeah, this is something very important because it also has some very interesting theoretical implications. Because when people look at North Korea, it is like very widely recognized and often repeated in a kind of like stereotypical way that, oh, this is a very nationalist regime, very nationalist country. And of course, this nationalism comes from the legacy of Japanese colonial rule, from the struggle against the Japanese. So it looks like totally logical to assume that, oh, after this legacy, they must be very anti-Japanese. And the irony is, it's not so simple. Not at all. That in the mid 1950s, late 1950s, when we look at North Korea and South Korea and their attitudes toward Japan, we absolutely find that the South Koreans under Lee Hsien-man are much more aggressively hostile toward Japan than North Korea. And indeed, North Korea is purposefully trying to take advantage of that. That because, of course, Lee Hsien-man is like their total enemy, with whom is absolutely nothing is possible. So they welcome the issue that now Lee Hsien-man is getting into this tangle with Japan. And if we cannot do anything with Lee Hsien-man and really don't want to, then let's try the other way around. And they do get a kind of good external stimulus for doing that, because the Soviets tried the same, the Chinese tried the same. They tried to make the Japanese less rely on the Americans, to give them some incentive to be more independent. So the North Koreans are rather willing to play this game. And sometimes very unusual things happen. Like, for example, in 1959, when there is the 14th anniversary of the big anti-Japanese protest of 1919, the March 1st movement, then North Korea deliberately does not celebrate it in a big way, just in a very ordinary way, because this is the period when they negotiate with Japan about repatriation. So they really don't want to provoke the Japanese or like openly criticize them. This is the period when Kim Il-sung tells a visiting Mongolian delegation that, well, if any Japanese person wants to visit North Korea, he can come here totally safe. Nobody will be hostile to him. So this is one aspect that they try to play the Japan card against South Korea. But then later, and this brings us back to the economic issue, by the early 60s, when the relationship with the Soviet Union gets worse and worse, and they feel that the Soviets are really ripping us off, then they also realize that Japan is a better partner economically than the Russians, because Japanese industrial technology is better, it is cheaper, then the Japanese pay a higher price for our minerals. So they start purposefully reorient themselves toward the Japanese. So it really gives us a reason to look into this matter in a more sophisticated way than this kind of like primitive model of nationalism, because by this logic they should be so anti-Japanese, but in fact they can do it in a very practical way that if we want to be anti-Japanese we are, if we don't want then we tone it down.
That's launched forward then to 2012, and of course we're brushing over the those crisis years in the late 1990s and early 2000s with nuclear tests. But let's jump to 2012. Lee Myung-bak is leaving office. Park Geun-hye is coming into office, and there is this uh, very open gesture towards China from Park. She visits China and refuses to visit Japan, and China reciprocate this response, and there is this deep early loving between the two countries. And North Korea very quickly get their game going in some ways here. They begin, and I didn't realize this is very interesting. They start talking about the threat that THAAD might pose to China almost a year before China starts speaking about it. And they are desperately trying to break up this relationship.
Yeah, definitely. And this is again something very important because it must be taken into consideration that here the Chinese approach and the North Korean approach may partly overlap, but they are also very significantly different. Because to put it in a very simple way, for North Korea, South Korea is a sort of existential threat. Not an active threat, but a sort of potential threat, which means that this is a country which can eventually absorb us if it can, if it has a chance. So they really have this permanent rivalry with South Korea. Of course, they also have the American problem, but still South Korea is a constant rivalry for them. For China, South Korea is not a threat. It can be a kind of like uncomfortable neighbor, but not a threat. The US is a threat, Japan is a threat, South Korea is not. So the Chinese approach is that we try to have a good relationship both with North Korea and South Korea if we can. We really don't want to support North Korea against South Korea. Against the US, maybe. Against South Korea, we don't exactly like the idea. So this is really creating a kind of like double problem for the North Koreans. Because first of all, the Chinese try to maintain a balance. And the second is that if the Chinese have a problem with Japan, as it happened exactly in the period you mentioned, the Chinese are really happy to take the opportunity of playing the South Koreans against the Japanese if there is any chance for that. And if it can be done at the expense of the North Korean interests, so be it. They would do it. And they did. So this really created a very weird situation that Park Geun-hye, as you mentioned, visits China, and she's very much welcome there. And then both the Japanese, Abe, and this North Koreans, Kim Jong-un, they feel being sidelined, which makes them to approach each other, which is very unlikely situation, but it still happens. So it really like turns the whole models of like conventional logic upside down, because the Chinese, instead of like supporting their traditional partner North Korea, they rather bypass it in favor of South Korea. And then the North Koreans, instead of being anti-Japanese, they try to reach some accommodation with Abe, who should be like the total like enemy from their like ideological perspective.
Let's talk about that close relationship then, or the strained relationship, I guess I should say, between Japan and South Korea. And let's talk about that estrangement there that we spoke about, and this separation of a kind, and how the rapprochement affected things as well. So there's a partial lifting of Japanese sanctions on North Korea in exchange for North Korea's willingness to talk about those abductees. And then, of course, this upsets America and South Korea quite heavily. And America gets involved. And this is always that interesting wedge here. So the best efforts of North Koreans and the Chinese to separate South Korea and Japan is always countered by Americans' desperate attempts to keep them back together. And then you write, interestingly, that Pyongyang steps up its confrontational attitude towards Seoul. And of course, this backfires badly. And what happens then is there's just a heightened acceleration in this growing rapprochement between South Korea and Japan.
Well, it's again a kind of complicated matter, because again, to look back into the Chinese logic, that of course they are not happy with the US South Korean connection, but they are willing to take it as a fact that for South Korea, the American connection will be always number one, and China cannot replace that. At best, China can hope that to keep South Korea somewhere in the middle between Washington and Beijing. However, what China really resents is a strong bilateral contact between Japan and South Korea. This they want to prevent. So they try to push South Korea toward a direction which would put China to second place and cut out Japan as much as possible, which is going totally against the American policy of trying to make a triangle, US, Japan, South Korea all working together against North Korea, of course, but by implication also against China. So it's a very difficult situation for South Korea. And then one logical way out would be to pursue what was done before, this kind of China, Japan, South Korea triangle, and then it would like resolve this kind of problem, that they can work with each other one by one and all together, instead of excluding any of the three. However, the problem is that if they do it, then the North Koreans really don't like it. So it's very difficult to make everybody happy, because sometimes the US feels being excluded, sometimes the North Koreans feel being excluded, sometimes the Japanese, sometimes the Chinese. So it's a very, very difficult geopolitical environment.
And I might add, you add this here, and sometimes the Russians feel excluded. And you talk about 2014, and this is pretty pertinent today with this crisis in Ukraine coming back. And you're right, the sanctions and the participation that Tokyo had in the US-led sanctions against Moscow caused significant friction here, and suddenly it stimulated a return and a rapprochement between Russia and China as well. So there's always that shadow in the background here of Russia as well lurking over things. And I might open that back up to also with this question of Japan and China involved in this, and some of the conflicts that still linger there and things that split them open. So the South China Sea crisis, the Trans-Pacific partnership, and things like this. I might open the field up there too. I've opened up Russia and Japan and China there, but it seems like a very pertinent moment for all of those issues.
Yeah, the Russian factor is really something interesting here, because in the literature, what we can find, it is kind of generally recognized by Professor Lankov and Anthony Rinna and others that compared to China, Russia is a sort of marginal player in North Korea. Then economically and other ways, their contacts with North Korea are not so broad, absolutely not so broad like the Chinese connection. But Russia plays a role in another way, which is often kind of overlooked as a sort of alternative, and not exactly in that traditional way that because there is Russia, therefore North Korea can rely on Russia against China. This is not exactly so, because the Russians are not deeply involved enough to really provide a real counterweight to China. But there is another way Russia makes an impact. It's a counterweight to North Korea in a way, from a Chinese perspective. So what I mean that if, for example, China wants to reach the sea, which Koreans prefer to call the Eastern Sea, Japanese call the Sea of Japan. Now, there are several possibilities of making a transport corridor from Northeast China to the sea. You can go through Russia, you can go through North Korea. Now, if the Russians are not being cooperative, then the Chinese have an incentive to try to use the North Korean connection, Rajin. If, however, the Russians appear cooperative, then the Chinese don't need North Korea so much, they can ignore it. Similarly, if North Korea is acting up, like doing nuclear tests and things like that, and then the Americans retaliate by deploying THAAD, which the Chinese don't like. One logical expectation would be that if the Chinese are unhappy with THAAD, then they would possibly back up North Korea. However, in practice, they did not, because they are also unhappy with the North Korean actions. And most importantly, they have Russia as an alternative. They don't need to go to Pyongyang if they can go to Moscow. So, by cooperating with Russia, the Chinese really could have their cake and eat it too, because they could say we condemn THAAD because the Russians agree. The Russians also had their problem with this American missile defense system. So they are very ready to support the Chinese in this matter. But the Russians can also say, well, we don't agree with the North Korean nuclear test either. So what the Chinese did in practice was to put a pressure on both Koreas, North and South. They put a pressure on South Korea that why you are deploying THAAD. They put a pressure on North Korea That's why you are acting up again. And instead of being isolated from as a result, they could still maintain a relatively good position by cooperating with Russia. So this is the kind of interesting way that Russia can influence the situation very much simply because it's there. Because if it's there, then Pyongyang or Beijing or even Tokyo can go to Moscow. They don't have to go somewhere else.
Let's make one last jump, and acutely aware of the time we're running out of here. But there is one last point, and you touched on it a fair bit there, actually. So it's a good segue in here, and this is the confrontational acts that North Korea often engage in, and another paper of yours. And this is what most people pay attention to. They notice the behavior of North Korea and its missile launches and its belligerence and things like this. And then they look to China to hopefully sway and bring them back in. And this is really interesting article of yours. And you write about the post 1953 history and things like this. And you go on to say that China's attitude towards North Korean belligerence is ambiguous in a way, and it's deeply rooted in history. It's not as standard and not as structured as you would imagine. It runs a lot more to do with the change in relationships at the time in the region.
Yeah, this is very much true. Because around that time, like 2000, after 2010, there were a lot of publications about the China-North Korean relationship. And then scholars, especially American scholars, but also South Koreans, they would try to create some sort of constant model that always it's a bit like this. That either they emphasize the closeness or they emphasize the elements of tension. And like very recently, Professor Shenji Hua wrote a really very important, very interesting monograph, A Misunderstood Friendship, about the historical relationship between Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung. And he also provided a lot of archival evidence about the problems, about the hidden tensions. So it is very easy to like do any of the conclusions that either that is a very close relationship or there is a lot of problems and they don't really like each other. However, what I feel important to emphasize that for China, because it's a really big power with a very wide ranging interest, North Korea is just one partner among many. And when China's relations change with other countries, then North Korea becomes more important or less important, or more like welcomed or less welcomed partner. If we can use North Korea against somebody else with whom we have a really serious problem at the moment, we are going to use it. If North Korea is like making trouble, which hinders us to cooperate with somebody with whom we want a good relationship now, then we don't like North Korea over much. So this is what I try to argue in this article, that we need to look into the specific context of each crisis. And then we can see that in some cases, in some periods, China had the motivation to push on North Korea and restrain them. And then in other cases, they had much less reason for do it. Like, again, we have now this problem that it's a really very big tangle, because in 2016, 2017, China was very dissatisfied with North Korean behavior and put a lot of pressure on them. In the end, this pressure did help North Korea to become more constructive, more peaceful, less aggressive. Then there was a chance of having some reconciliation with the United States. Eventually, it did not go nowhere. So the Chinese eventually concluded that the Americans are at fault, at least partly or morally, mostly. So now, after several years of waiting and maintaining the sanction system because the Americans insisted on that, the Chinese concluded that, well, this is not going anywhere and we don't want to play the American game forever. So now we have this weird situation that North Korea did not get much from the US as long as it behaved nicely and the Chinese were willing to play along. But now North Korea is testing missiles again, and now the Chinese patience have run thin, but with America. So now the Chinese are really not helping the US to put more pressure on North Korea. Instead, they say enough is enough. Now it's the Americans' turn to do something better. And why? Partly, as I said, because they felt that the Americans missed the chance, but even more so because the Sino-American relations are really getting worse and worse. Since the trade war started by Trump, then followed by Biden, this kind of general rivalry with China. So now the Chinese have zero motivation to help out the Americans. So as I said, this is a big tangle because now if the US finally gives some concessions, it will look like that after North Korea threatened and showed some muscle, then finally the Americans gave in. So this would send the message that if you act aggressively, then you get things. If you act nicely, you don't get. This is really a bad scenario. If the Americans don't do anything, they maintain their kind of like critical position and doing nothing, then the Chinese would say, well, then this is the Americans' fault. This is why things are not improving. So we really have a very big problem here because now very difficult to get out of this tangle.
Very at the very end of that article, you do create a framework of a kind, or at least a pattern that you point to. So for all the historical subtlety and all the actual detail on the ground, which is guiding policy, you do put forward at least four things that seem to repeat itself or seem to become a part of the pattern. Number one, China's is always far more critical of North Korea's nuclear provocations as opposed to any other provocations, such as the Chonan or the Yonpyeong crisis. Number two, you say that there's when there is an economic treat of a kind, economic engagement there. So when North Korea's belligerence declines, China is often ready with its own economic engagement strategy, ready to go. And number three, you go on to say that Pyongyang, of course, has this deep fixation on inter-Korean rivalry. And China is just not that interested in this. Instead of criticizing Seoul, they often criticize Washington's Korea policy in general. And the fourth part of this general pattern is, as you mentioned there in heavy detail, the third parties, the extra countries involved, and the prospect of cooperation with America or South Korea or Russia against a third party, such as Japan, just simply reduces the importance and significance of North Korea overall. So looking back, that's a very interesting pattern to recognize there. So I might get you to touch on that before we finish.
Yeah, I think that it is probably still valid. It is probably still valid because if there is a nuclear test, then it really has very wide-ranging implications because it may push some other countries to go on the nuclear path, and China doesn't want that. China definitely doesn't want Japan or South Korea to go nuclear. So this is definitely one very important point. When it comes to other matters like missiles, the Chinese can decide that now we react or we don't react. They can treat it flexibly, and this is what is happening now again. It is also true that the Chinese would prefer like peace and stability. It's not just empty talk. They do mean it. They do feel that if North Korea is behaving nicely, this is better for everybody. However, they also feel that we really considered Americans a bigger problem than North Korea. From a Chinese perspective, of course, North Korea is not a threat. It's a sort of like irritant. But the US is a threat very much, a strategic competitor. So they are not really willing to push North Korea unless the Americans give them some good positive incentive to do that. And it's also true that, as you mentioned, that if, for example, they have a reason to isolate Japan, and then if it can be done by cooperating with the US or with South Korea, then, for example, they would try it. So it's also true that they, the North Koreans can manipulate this system. They did. So, like by accepting, the olive branch from Moon Jae-in, and then meet or like promising to meet Trump, they did manage to secure meetings with Xi Jinping, who snubbed Kim Jong Un for many years before. So the North Koreans can play this game, but apparently it seems that they really don't want to play it too much. They really often step on the toes of China, and then China has to decide whether to retaliate or not. Sometimes they look away and kind of quietly swallow it. Sometimes they feel that they must show that who is who. So, in this sense, I would like to quote a kind of very, very old statement to sum it up, which is an ironic continuity with history. This is a statement going back to the late Qing dynasty, when, at by modern terms, we may say the foreign minister of that time, a reformist himself, Li Hongchang, he made a kind of private, very critical remark about the Joseon Korea, Korean kingdom. He wrote like this in his diary, that this is the country we have in Korea. They were really not useful for us in economic terms, but the tribute they brought to us was so little. And they always resent us when we try to tell them to do this or do that. They don't want to take advice. But if they get into some trouble, either internal trouble or external trouble, they come to us and ask us to help them out. So this was a kind of like resentment on the part of the Chinese, that we are being used by the North Koreans and not getting much out of it. But then the North Koreans also felt being used by China, because for China, North Korea is just one country on a very big chessboard.
A very last question, and at multiple times throughout your article, you did the very interesting thing that often good academic historians often do, and stop and say, this is a point where people need to do more research, or we need more documentation, or we need more insight here and different points. And I kept stopping and thinking, there are PhD students out there reading this and getting ideas for their PhDs or their next articles and things like this. So, as a very last question, where do you think the more interesting, or perhaps the more pressing areas of North Korea-China relationship should be studied, and where that research is desperately needed?
Well, almost everything can be interesting and important. As I recall, for example, one study which was extremely interesting by one Chinese scholar uh, associated with East China Normal University. He's a professor there, but not Shen Jihua, but another person working there, Liang Ji. And he did a very interesting research on the training of North Korean students in China in the 1950s. And then he quoted Chinese documents recording that how often the Chinese working environment or Chinese colleagues or Chinese students were really hostile toward the North Koreans and treating them as like country bumpkins and treated them badly. And then the Chinese authorities tried to like make them more friendly toward the North Koreans. So this kind of information is still very much lacking. The level of the information about interactions between ordinary people, between Chinese and North Koreans, because so much of the research is focused on matters of state, high level interactions. But how ordinary people see each other on the two sides of the border, how ordinary Chinese see the North Koreans, how ordinary North Koreans see the Chinese. Now, this is still very much under research, and it can be studied by doing some careful interviews and some like reading, for example, the Chinese social media, but it's still not so much extensively done, and it would be very interesting. So it would be really interesting to know because so little research has been done, especially from the North Korean side. So many times people studied how North Korean refugees think about South Korea, how they think about the United States. So little has been written how they think about China. And it's a kind of ironic aside and just a quick remark to sum it up, but this is a good example how surprising result we can get from talking to ordinary North Korean people, refugees in this case. So this was told to me by a Canadian friend, Craig Urquhart, who is really very like well involved in dealing with North Korean refugees. So they told him that when they come to South Korea, they were really like surprised by how much obsessed South Koreans are about the historical problems with Japan, that how much worked up they are because of comfort women and other things. And the North Koreans had a kind of attitude, what? This is history, 70 years before. Forget it, no longer important for us. So this is totally surprising because supposedly they were educated in North Korea so many years, that Japan is the enemy and all that. But in their private attitude, they just ignored all this historical baggage and they concentrate on the present material benefits which can be seen. So this is something very important to study, and I don't know if myself can study it, but definitely encourage everybody who is able to do it to look into these people-to-people interactions and perceptions, that how like ordinary North Korean and Chinese people see each other. because this would be definitely extremely interesting.
And that, of course, is a wonderful note to end the podcast on. As I said, I'm going to link the 4 articles that I used as research today that are Balazs'. I'm going to link them below directly so you can access them. I'm also going to link Balazs' academic profile. You can find all of his works, or at least all the ones that have been published and are open source, and also the links to our 2 previous podcasts together. On that, Balazs, it's always such a pleasure. I always learn so much. I always enjoy these chats so much. Thank you so much for your time.
And thanks a lot for the invitation. Very kind of you.